With great excitement, I introduce you to Northwood University, a truly exceptional institution in American higher education. Since 1959, this private, accredited university has been a vibrant bastion of free thought and enterprise, standing out among the thousands of other schools in the U.S. Known as America's Free Enterprise University, Northwood is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of leaders who drive global social and economic progress. At the heart of Northwood lies the Northwood idea, a philosophy that celebrates individual freedom, responsibility, and the importance of moral law and free enterprise. This entrepreneurial spirit is evident in that 1/3 of Northwood alumni own businesses. Northwood is more than an institution. It's a movement that empowers students to think critically and champion liberty. It is a rare gem in today's academic world. If you're passionate about supporting a university that values intellectual growth and free enterprise, or to learn more about its academic programs, visit northwood.edu.
Hi, everybody. This is Saad. Today, I have a repeat guest. I know that I've been on his show a few times, and I think this may be the second or third time I've got Dinesh D'Souza with me. How you doing, sir?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to just read a brief bio for the 3 or 4 people that might not know who you are. So you are a best-selling author. Now, here it's surprising because in the bio that your people sent me, they gave me sort of a stochastic number. He's written nearly 20 books, approximately. Can't we just know what the damn number is? Is it 20 books? Is it 15 books? Why is it unsure how many books you've written?
Well, it's somewhere in that range. And the reason I say that is because typically with authors, you publish a couple of books before you get a mainstream trade book that gets out into the stores. So that's why it's a little bit of an ambiguous count. But yeah, the number is somewhere between 15 and 20.
All right.
And by the way, with this new project, the new film, there is also an accompanying book of the same title. So I'm adding to the roster.
I will get to that in a second. So 2 of your documentaries, 2016, Obama's America and America, Imagine a World Without Her, people should check these out, are among the highest grossing political films of all time. You served as a domestic policy analyst at the Reagan White House. Maybe you've seen the recent Reagan movie that came out. I actually watched an early preview of it in Austin, Texas, a couple of years ago. You were also a scholar at think tanks such as the American Enterprise Institute and, the Hoover Institution at Stanford. You've got a new documentary coming out on September 27th called Vindicating Trump. And then the book is coming out on October 8th. I think it will be released, but people can pre-order it. Did I miss anything? You want to add anything before we drill down into your book?
I mean, all I want to add is that there is a movie website. It's vindicatingtrump.com. And that's like a one-stop shop. The cool thing is that the movie is opening in a lot of theaters, 850 theaters. So you can just plug in your city or your zip code, and it pulls up all the theaters around you. So you can buy tickets right there. So it's like a one-stop shop to pre-order the book, yes, but also to see the movie.
Okay, so let's just get down into some of the key premises of the book. Take it away. What's the book about? I mean, I guess the title says it, but give us a bit more details.
Well, the way that the book is framed is it is sort of built around a problem that was foreseen by, of all people, Abraham Lincoln. In his so-called Lyceum speech, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech in his late 20s, not his best-known speeches, because he's best known for the Gettysburg Address and, of course, the second inaugural. But in his younger days, Lincoln gave a speech where he warned that America is not going to be ever destroyed by an attack from outside the country. He says that if the country is subverted, if the constitutional republic is overthrown, it is likely to be from within. And he predicted that the way it would happen, if it ever did happen, is that there would be a rampant lawlessness that would begin to creep into the society, And then he says a kind of a dictator, a Caesar, a Napoleon, an Alexander the Great would seize upon this lawlessness, manipulate it, and the combination of the lawlessness and then the appropriation of it by some sort of a dictator, and Lincoln doesn't name who it is going to be the biggest threat that the country faces. Now, what's interesting is in our own day, there are people, smart guys, who look at this Lyceum speech and go, oh, well, Lincoln was really prophetic. He was predicting the dictator, and here we have him. His name is Donald J. Trump. So the book and the film take this premise seriously. In other words, I agree that the threat of dictatorship is real. I raise the question, is it coming from Trump? Is it coming from somewhere else? Where is the threat really coming from? And the movie takes off from there.
Got it. Now, I've discussed this in the past, and I've weighed in on this matter. Most recently, I wrote a Newsweek opinion piece where I was talking about the difference between emotional-based processing versus cognitive-based processing. The idea being that, for example, in advertising, if you're trying to sell a hedonic product like perfumes, then you might activate your affective-based processing, right? You simply show a beautiful girl on a horse with her hair flowing, and you put a cool brand name, Mystère, and that's how you sell perfumes. On the other hand, if I want to sell you reverse mortgages, I don't put a pretty girl on a horse. I have to tell you, here are the 6 reasons why you should invest in reverse mortgages. Now, when it comes to choosing a president, you'd like to think that people are going to use their cognitive-based system. Here are 6 substantive reasons why I think Kamala Harris is better or Donald Trump is better. Regrettably, as I repeatedly keep pounding on the table, people use their emotional-based processing. She's joyful, she's fun, she's exciting. Is there a way for us to get people to move away from the natural inclination to use a shortcut heuristic, such as my emotions, and actually get them to focus on foundational substantive issues? Because many of my colleagues in academia, as you might imagine, they probably support more Donald Trump's policies, but their emotional system says, he's disgusting, I revile him.
I think this is actually the key difference between a book and a film. And I'll put it this way, that a book is, in fact, an intellectual product. It appeals to the mind. It is framed in, I would say, loosely as a legal brief. It makes an argument, and the argument has components, and it lays it out. It's got references. It's got footnotes. So I have all of that in the book. I recognize the moment I start to make a movie, I'm in a different territory. Right. You notice that movies, documentary films, and feature films always have a musical score. What does the musical score do? That is, in fact, the emotional undercurrent of a movie. So the point I want to make is that I don't think that one can say to people, hey, listen, do not use your emotional apparatus. Merely let me engage your brain. What a movie will do is, in a very subtle way, it will engage both. In fact, the primary engagement of a film is always emotional. You can put intellectual content into a movie, but it can never be primary. If it is primary, the movie becomes dull. It becomes boring. So I will say that if you watch this film, Vindicating Trump, it makes the emotional case for Trump. And not only that, I would say it makes the character defense of Trump. This is important because there are Republicans who will say things like, well, I don't like the guy, but, I like his policies. Or he needs to keep his mouth shut. Or what they're really saying is they want to remake Trump. They want like a new and different Trump. And I make a counter argument to them. And I say, listen, Trump is a package in the same way that General Grant was a package. And the same package that made him a good fighter on the battlefield also made him cuss a lot and drink a lot. And so you can't say, hey, he needs to cut out the drinking. He needs to cut out the cussing. Otherwise, you need to yank him off the battlefield. Lincoln would never dream of doing that because General Grant knew how to fight. And I think the same is true with Trump. He has some vices, but he also has some quite magnificent and underrated virtues. And those need to be not only noted, but they need to be experienced. And in a movie, I try to bring you the experience of that. I also try to do something else that I think that Trump himself makes it hard to do, and that is to show you the private side of Trump. Trump himself is does not like to talk about feelings. He doesn't like to talk about emotions. When poor Dr. Phil kept trying to psychologize him, well, how did the assassination attempt make you feel? You notice that Trump just ran away from that. He refused to go there. He's been raised in this manly reluctance to put your feelings out front. But I tried very hard in this film, and I think succeeded in having a one-on-one conversation with him where he allowed me to control the conversation and bring out some aspects of him that he otherwise doesn't. He certainly doesn't easily show.
I love your answer about, movies triggering our emotional system, because I've argued exactly to your point that it's silly to argue that humans are either reasoning animals or feeling animals. We're, of course, both. The key challenge is to know when to invoke the right system, right? But to your point about, the fact that he can be funny and quote non-presidential and maybe bombastic, you're exactly right that that's part of his appeal. If I can analogize to my own reality, before we began and I pressed the record button, you said something very kind to me. You said, "Oh, I love reading your sarcastic tweets and so on." Right? Well, it turns out, Dinesh, that many of the people that approach me on the street won't approach me to say, "Oh, I loved your application of evolutionary biology in studying the increase in testosterone that met," right? They will respond to, "Oh my God, I was in stitches watching your satirical clip where you were making fun of progressives." And so the reason I'm drawing this analogy is that if you are in the game of trying to persuade people, you will use your entire arsenal of persuasion strategies to try to get to people, specifically to your point about a book versus a movie. In some cases, I stand up in front of the Stanford Business School crowd and I'm extremely professorial. That's why Stanford invites me. In other cases, when I'm trying to reach other people, I will now put on my quote buffoonish hat. But actually, it's not at all buffoonish, because it takes a very unique skill to be able to be a satirist. That's why dictators will kill off the satirists first before they kill off the guys with the big, muscles, because they are the guys who are a threat to the authoritarian regime. So I can't, for the life of me, understand why supposedly my smart colleagues can't appreciate that the fact that Trump is unique in his personhood is precisely what makes him so effective. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, Trump is, well, first of all, he is a wannabe comedian. And he's a pretty good one. He certainly is a very creative deviser of one-liners, very memorable one-liners. Think about even his insults are quite creative because they stick to people. Now, there's a downside to this, because if you put a label on somebody and it sticks to them and they can never get out of it, they will hate you for the rest of your life because you have tagged them and they are stuck. Notice that the left has never been that successful in doing the same to Trump. They've applied enormous creative energy to doing it. The best they are Mango Mussolini, Orange Man. I mean, this is very weak stuff compared to Trump's own labels, which are really very crushing. Trump also does another thing, which is that he taunts the other side. I'll be a dictator for a day. Or he puts out Trump 28, Trump 32, Trump 36. Now, the left, pretends to misunderstand him, because then they'll say, well, look, this guy is obviously planning to be a dictator. Well, real dictators don't joke about being dictator for a day. And not to mention the fact that Trump has, of course, been in office, so you can observe his conduct. He might have been somewhat egregious, maybe even irresponsible in encouraging shouts of "lock her up" in the campaign, but did he lock her up? No, he didn't. In fact, they didn't even initiate criminal proceedings against Hillary, and arguably there were plenty of reasons to be able to do so. In other words, it's not like she didn't violate any of the federal statutes, so they could have brought charges, but they chose not to. I think, when Debbie, my wife, and I first met Trump, this was in 2019. He had given me a pardon for a weird campaign finance offense that the Obama administration had gotten me on, and he invited me to come and have a chat in the Oval Office. Now, my wife asked him a very interesting question. She said to him, she goes, you're a billionaire. You've got Mar-a-Lago. You are flayed and attacked on every platform every second of every day. Like, why do you do it? How do you do it? How do you even put up with it? And we expected Trump to laugh and say, ha, 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 these people are idiots. I enjoy it. I'm like a pig in slop and so on. But he didn't say that. He stepped back and he goes, I have to admit that at times it does get to me. He goes, I don't really need it. I'm doing it for the country. I just, got rid of al-Baghdadi, and here they are. They're piling on me even for that. And when Debbie and I left that meeting, we said to ourselves, that remark showed a vulnerability that you very rarely see on Trump. And Debbie goes, if he would show more of that part of himself to the American people, they would warm to him immediately. And so when I sat down with Trump, and this was after the assassination attempt, the first assassination attempt, I thought to myself, I should try very hard to draw out that aspect of Trump. And I think I did.
And I want to talk about your personal interaction with him, but exactly to your point, when Debbie asked him those questions and it showed vulnerability, I recently watched snippets of his appearance on Greg Gutfeld's show, which and I got the exact same feeling as the one that you just described, where he was understated. He was allowing other people the space to actually speak, because Trump is a larger than life character, right? And so you wonder. So, for example, if I'm thinking, would I get along with him when we're sitting and having a coffee? My feeling is absolutely yes. But I wonder if I would ever have the opportunity to utter a single syllable, because the whole room, the oxygen might be completely sucked up by him. But when I watched him on Gutfeld, I didn't get that at all. I saw, in a sense, I mean, I think it wouldn't be the right word to say vulnerability, but he was a lot less monopolistic in taking over. So in your personal interactions, what I just said, did that hold true?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you a little vignette that actually comes out of 2000 Mules, my earlier film, because Trump, he had watched the film in advance. So he was very curious about the findings connected to election fraud, cell phone geo-tracking and all of that. But at the premiere, he watched the film a second time, and he was sitting right next to me. And I noticed that he was doing a very Trumpian thing. He was giving a sort of a running commentary as the film was going on. But the commentary was not about the content of the film. It was actually about the technical aspects of the film. So he would say things like, Dinesh, I really like the music. He'd go, where do you get that music? Do you buy the music? Do you have someone compose the music? And then he would say, Dinesh, he goes, your voice. He goes, you have a movie voice. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that. And it's a really good thing you have a movie voice. He goes, because if you didn't, you'd have to hire somebody else to narrate your films. And so I was being subjected to this guy. And then I realized, this guy was on The Apprentice. This guy has a great interest in popular culture. He's not an academic, he's a doer. So when he sees a film, he thinks about, how did that film get made? Where does the soundtrack come from? So he is interested in the mechanical aspects of getting things done, not just in a sense in the theoretical.
Very interesting. Did you speak to him about non-political issues? What are some things that you love to do when you're trying to turn off, which seems to me almost impossible for a guy in his position? What kind of books do you read and so on? Did you get that level of intimacy, or was it very much restricted to his political life?
In the interview in the film, I focus on the political side because I got 45 minutes with him. There's about probably 25 minutes in the film. But ever since my first meeting with Trump, I've had quite a bit of interaction with him. And it's always kind of funny because my son-in-law, for example, is running for Congress. In fact, very likely to be the next congressman in the northern suburbs of Dallas. So I had texted Trump and then talked to him about endorsing my son-in-law. And the funny thing about it was he goes, I'll do it, Dinesh. He goes, but don't forget me. And I realized I felt like I was in the opening scene of The Godfather, where, I'm asking him to do me a favor, but he's taking note of it and going, I might be calling on you to do me a service one of these days. And then later he was talking to my son-in-law after my son-in-law won his primary, and he goes, put Dinesh on. I want to talk to the master. And then obviously my son-in-law and my daughter are howling with laughter. They're going, he calls you the master, you know? And so Trump is he's a character and quite an amusing fellow. I don't see him as a kind of a deep reader, but he has a kind of foraging and curious intellect, and it moves from ideas to getting things done, and it has a great deal of curiosity in people. He has a remarkable memory. He can meet you after years, and not only does he remember you, he remembers where he met you. So that kind of thing, I think, has a very striking impact on people.
Beautiful. Do you think there has ever been a president that has faced anywhere near the amount of animus, whether it be the legal stuff or the actual assassination attempts or the smearing? Is there anyone else that comes to mind that's even close to the magnitude of animus that this guy receives?
I would say that the only person I can think of is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, like Trump, had people who would take a bullet for him, and then had people who would cheer when somebody else put a bullet in him. In other words, when John Wilkes Booth actually assassinated Lincoln. But here's the key difference. With Lincoln, it wasn't really over the man, right? With Lincoln, it was over the issue. It was over slavery. That's what produced the opposite reactions. But with Trump, it is over the man. And in some ways, I've tried to come to grips and understand why this is so. Why is there an animus against Trump that, for example, exceeds that of any other Republican? Why, you know, I can say Trump is not a dictator and didn't govern as a dictator, but I still have to ask myself, well, why did they apply that particular epithet to him? Nobody called Reagan a dictator. They would say, he's a washed-up movie actor, he's a buffoon, he doesn't really understand the world, but they didn't say he's trying to subvert our democracy. Why do they say that about Trump? And that, I think, is one of the central enigmas of the film, and I try to resolve it in the movie and, of course, in the book.
Are you willing to give us a bit of a hint of what your answer is, or you don't want to?
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it in a brief way by way of an analogy, because I think you really like this one. Before I came to America, I didn't know anything about America. I'd never met a white person before. My main exposure was through movies, war movies and westerns. So I've thought a lot about the American Western. I have, of course, my own favorites, but I realized upon reflection that all the Western movies have sort of the same plot. And in the plot, you've got a very harmonious town. Call it Shinbone or call it Pleasantville. It's going really well. There's an old sheriff with a toothbrush mustache and an old rifle. I'm going to call that guy the GOP establishment. But then some gangsters come in, right? Some really ruthless bad guys, and they shoot up the town. They subdue the sheriff. They take over the saloon and the provision store, and they're running the place. And the point is that Shinbone is no longer Shinbone. It's another country now. It's another town. The old Shinbone is kind of gone. But then over the mountain comes an outsider. So this is Trump. Not a lot is known about him. He appears to be a sort of shady character in some ways.
Sorry to interrupt you. Clint Eastwood and spaghetti westerns. That's who he is.
That's it. That's what I'm talking about. And the point is that when he comes over the mountain, the gangsters, in a way, understand him better than the townspeople, because the townspeople are like, who is this guy? We don't really get him. You know, he needs to give some explanation of where he's coming from. There's a rumor that he may have murdered a guy 30 years ago. But the gangsters know this is the guy we have to fear. This is the one guy who can take down our whole operation. We need to mobilize all our efforts to buy him off, to brutalize him, to kill him. And the plot takes off from there. So I see, in some ways, America as sort of living within the framework of a Western, with the only difference that we don't really know the ending.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy. And I think Victor Davis Hanson often will draw on similar Western analogies. So I love it. Now, I understand. So in the analogy that you set up, the establishment doesn't want the outsider to come and drain the swamp, right? As he says. But how do you explain it? Even before I get you to answer it, I'm going to offer an answer, and then you could maybe add to it or correct me if I'm wrong. How do you explain why the people who are not in the swamp exhibit equal animus, if not even greater animus towards him? So, for example, all of my academic colleagues who are not operating within the scam of the swamp are just as much, emboldened in hating him, right? Now, so let me give you my explanation for why they hate him, and then you could tell me if. So I argued actually in the parasitic mind that Trump is an aesthetic injury to them, right? So uh, here is the proper way that you ascend in polite society. You have to speak with a progressive lisp. You have to hold your pinky when you sip a particular way. That's how you are presidential. That's how you become a professor. Now, here comes this guy that doesn't seem to adhere to any of our metrics of what constitutes aesthetic elegance, speaking with the correct elocution. Therefore, if he could ascend to the highest political office, it invalidates the entire edifice of what constitutes why we are the anointed one, to use Thomas Sowell's term. Do you think it could be as simple as that, or is there anything else that you would add as to why all of my colleagues also think that he's indistinguishable from Hitler?
So I'd like to give a complementary explanation
Sure.
that complementary in the sense of running alongside yours. It's different than yours, but I think you'll see that the two together actually are stronger than one. And this is it. Let's say that there's a bully in a schoolyard and he's terrorizing all the kids in the schoolyard. The kids now, on the other hand, are not only being subdued, but their pride is wounded. Their pride is wounded because they are under the thumb of the bully. And they do not have the ability or the courage to fight back against the bully. And so what they do as a form of coping with that is they pretend that the situation is not as dire as they think. And when another bully shows up, a counter bully, let's call it, and that's Trump. Let's remember, Trump never bullies people who are beneath him.
Right.
But he's the best guy to take on the big bully and become the bigger bully. He actually knows how to deal with bullies. He deals with them in their own language. He's a little bit like Coriolanus in Shakespeare. Coriolanus takes the full measure of Phidias. They are both warriors and they have something in common. So Trump is our 800-pound gorilla against their 800-pound gorilla. Now, their 800-pound gorilla is not an individual, but as you know, it's the concatenation of multiple institutions. Theirs is a regime, but they have a gorilla. We have a gorilla. Now, here's the thing. I think that for a lot of people who don't have Trump's supreme virtue of courage, aren't willing to fight that kind of fight, and don't even know how to, they have turned their own cowardice into a virtue. And by that I mean is they declare, we don't like bullies. We don't even like bullies on our own side. We are too virtuous to be bullies ourselves. We want Trump to fight the way we do. Now, this is not a serious argument because if Trump fought the way that we do, he'd be in the same miserable position that the other Republicans are, where they are totally subservient to an emerging police state regime. So the argument, and here I'm drawing a little bit on the philosopher Nietzsche, is he talks about the fact that cowards don't like to look in the mirror and say, there stands a coward.
Right.
And so what they do is they turn their own weakness into a virtue, and they declare that on principle, the reason that they're not fighting like Trump is on principle, they are better than that. They are too good to do that kind of thing. I think this is less an explanation of the academic sector, but it's a good explanation of why there are Republicans and members of the Republican establishment that recognize the danger posed by the sort of Biden-Harris regime, but nevertheless, they point the finger at Trump, basically saying, you're fighting in the wrong way.
Go ahead, finish your point. Yeah.
No, that is the point. And there's even a biblical analogy. It's kind of like the Israelites saying to David, hey, David, we do want you to take on Goliath, but like put down your slingshot, man. That's not the way that we fight, or either that, or we can't use David because there was all this Bathsheba business. He doesn't even deserve to be one of us. He doesn't have the moral standing to represent. This is the kind of nonsense we're dealing with very often from people, I think, who lack the kind of resolve that Trump shows almost instinctively.
I love your explanation. I wholeheartedly agree with it. And to demonstrate how much I think you're vertical, I'm going to draw an analogy to my own life. So I talk at one point in the Parasitic Mind about going to speak at Stanford Business School, and the host, who was a fellow consumer psychologist who took me out to dinner the night before the next day when I was giving a talk, looks at me and says, "Oh, I found out, I did some Google searches that, whatever, you're friends with Joe Rogan and that you've been on his show." I said, "Yeah, actually, I'm probably going to be going on a show again pretty soon." And then, in a very, very smug way, exactly to your point about the cowardice and so on, he says, "Well, we don't condone that here at Stanford." I said, "You don't condone what at Stanford?" He goes, "Well, we don't do our research so that it could be sexy enough so that we can appear on Joe Rogan." I said, "Well, I don't do my research either to appear on Joe Rogan, but isn't it much better to be able to write a peer-reviewed article in a top scientific journal and appear on Joe Rogan? Isn't it the case that if you can excite 10, 20 million people about whatever it is, the ideas that you are writing about in your academic journals, wouldn't that be better?" But he was very smug about it precisely because from his perspective, he has mastered the medium of communication of peer-reviewed journals. Now, this other guy who can also go on the #1 show in the world, you would think professors are in the business of creating knowledge and disseminating knowledge. Without the dissemination, there's no point to the knowledge you create. But he looked down at it because he can't do it. Therefore, he's got to bring you down. I think it exactly fits with the explanation that you gave.
And resonates with me enormously. God, when I was at the American Enterprise Institute, at the Hoover Institution, I was known, but only in small precincts, because there's a sort of an intellectual conservative world. It's today a little fragmented, but it certainly existed in the early 2000s. And I was very much part of that. And I was respected even by the liberals because, in a sense, we talked the same language. We went to the same conferences. I'd go to Trover Bookstore in Washington, D.C. There was E.J. Dionne of the New York Times. Now, the moment I made my first film, which was 2016 Obama's America, it was in 2,000 theaters. It made $33 million in the box office, right? Now, here's my point. That number reverberated across Washington, D.C. And sure enough, 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, an article appears in the Atlantic Monthly. Whatever happened to Dinesh D'Souza? The theme of the article was that I had sort of sold out for money. That somehow that I had cut my teeth in the intellectual world, and now I'd become a populist. Now I was, in a sense, making movies that were appealing to the ordinary American. So it's very similar to your experience. And again, it's coming out of envy. It's coming out of people who say, "I don't know how to do that. Therefore, that thing must not be a worthwhile thing to do."
Exactly. I call it the garage band effect. If I am a starving artist that plays in my garage in front of my mom and my girlfriend, it's really cool. It's really romantic. If we then make it to #1 on the Billboard and we play Wembley Stadium, we sold out. Exactly to your point. All right. So what are some things going into your chat with Trump that you didn't expect and somehow surprise you, whether it be on the personal level, anything that he said, an anecdote, anything that you could share that would make us say, "Wow, I didn't know that about Trump"?
I'll just give a single example and really frame it more as a question than rather Trump's answer. Here's why. I wanted to surprise Trump in the interview. I wanted to let people see the tumblers falling inside of Trump's brain while he processes something that he hasn't really quite heard. So he hears certain type of stock questions, and as you might expect, since he gives interviews, he's got stock answers that are kind of ready-made. So I say to Trump this. I said, in fact, I almost started the interview this way. I said, "You've been repeatedly accused of calling for an insurrection." I said, "As far as I can see, you didn't actually do that. You didn't ask people to go in the Capitol. You didn't ask them to take over the place. You didn't ask them to stop the counting. You didn't do that." I said, "But guess what? Had you called for an insurrection on January 6th, there probably would have been one." And I said, "And there probably will be one today if you were to call for one today." In other words, are you aware that you have that kind of power? And how does that make you feel? Now, that's the kind of question where I could see Trump, in a sense, taking stock of that, because I don't think it quite heard it put that way. He recognized that it was true. but he also recognized that he was in a bit of a minefield, because really what I was saying to him, to put it slightly differently and put it in the context of the Lincoln problem I said before, is I was sort of saying to him, you know what? You're not a dictator. You didn't govern as a dictator, but you do have some of those larger than life dimensions of a Caesar. I can kind of see why the left always accuses you of being that, because you are a larger than life figure. If there's a room with 500 people, and the typical Republican enters the room, nobody's heads turn. He's just one of the crowd. But if Trump walks in the room, there's an immediate electricity. And I've seen it happen more than once. By the way, it happened with Reagan. Trump is not unique in this regard, but not many people have that magnetic quality where the whole room turns simultaneously. And Trump's answer becomes very interesting, because he's now forced to consider, do I have those dimensions? Do I want that kind of power? What would I do with it if I had it? So the engagement becomes very interesting, because Trump is thinking on his feet.
Wow. I don't know if you're ready to make these kinds of predictions, but today, if I ask you, Dinesh, how are you feeling about Kamala versus Trump? Are you willing to offer us your prognosis?
Yeah, I feel pretty good about it, but my feeling pretty good about it is based upon an assumption that is going to be tested in November. And that assumption is essentially the level of savviness or awareness of the American people, right? I mean, that's always the test in a democracy. So I think what's going on is that the American people have already made certain conclusions. They don't like the way things are going. They think the economy is not in good shape. They think we're a bit of a disaster in the foreign policy zone. They want a change. Now, there's an iron rule in American politics that when the population feels this way, they're going to throw the bums out. That's all that they know how to do, and that's all they have the power to do in an election. However, we have now a uniform media, a mainstream media, that is coming before these same people and saying, do not believe your eyes. Do not believe your lying eyes. Do not believe your pocketbook. Do not believe your retirement account. Do not even believe the things that you have directly seen and observed about Kamala Harris. We have created for you a new and different Kamala Harris. Here she is. Believe this picture. Now, it takes a great deal of naivete and buffoonery to go for this. And yet, we're going to find out if the American people will go for it. And if they go for it, I think it'll be a very negative reflection on the judgment of the American people. Now, the reason I think that people aren't that dumb and won't go for it is because I find, even and a movie analogy here is kind of helpful. You take an ordinary American who's even not that bright, you put him in a movie. You show him a kind of complex whodunit, and there's obviously some usual suspects, but the ordinary guy is pretty shrewd about saying, it can't be that guy. And you know what? They want us to think it's this guy, but I don't think it's this guy. I actually think it's that woman over there that nobody suspects. And here's why I think that. So people are actually, you put them in a dark room and turn the lights out, and they're able to figure things out that are not only intellectual propositions, but involve a shrewd understanding of human nature and of the situation as it is. If people apply that kind of intelligence to what's going on in the country, I think we'll be fine.
Well, let's hope. Now, since you mentioned a movie analogy, do you remember the movie Dinesh in 1979, Being There, starring Peter Sellers?
I remember it very well.
So do you know where I'm going with this?
Go for it. I'm eager to hear what you say about it.
I mean,
Kamala, right?
I wish I was the one who had that brilliant insight, but I heard it on Megyn Kelly's show. I can't remember the name of the guest who made that point. But coincidentally, I had just watched the movie for the first time coming back from a flight, some speaking engagement. And I remember from my childhood, I think I must have been maybe 14 when the movie came out, that it became sort of a classic. And I said, okay, I'm just going to spend the next 2 hours watching this movie. And then here comes Kamala Harris. So the movie, for those of you who don't know of Being There, is this somewhat mentally challenged man who's been completely sheltered as a gardener in this, within this enclave of a compound house. The guy who's been taking care of him passes away. He's catapulted into the world, and through a bunch of serendipitous situations, he ends up being sort of this guru that has the ear of the president of the United States. It's really quite a brilliant movie. And then that person on Megyn Kelly's show said, well, Kamala Harris is Peter Sellers in being there. And as I heard that, I said, oh my God, yes, it is. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Well, the analogy, I think, it works to a point, but there is an element of difference that's worth noting, because if you notice, what makes the movie so ingenious and makes it also very funny is that the gardener, Peter Sellers, will say things that are absolutely blasé. Right. At one point, one of these finance guys says to him, well, he's referring to a balance sheet. And Peter Sellers says, what's a balance sheet? And the guy goes, exactly. Now, what the finance guy means is that balance sheets don't tell you a true picture of the company. But of course, that's not what Peter Sellers means. He means he genuinely doesn't know what a balance sheet is. And so the audience is sort of in the know. We know. And so we laugh. Now, with Kamala Harris, what's going on is, yes, she utters Peter Sellers-like banalities, absolute idiocies. But what's happening is, I think, knowingly, the press will then take her statements and attribute enormous profundity to them, and also psychological qualities that are simply not there. Like, this statement indicates emotional warmth, or this statement indicates a shrewd appreciation of human nature. No, it doesn't. So what's happening is that in the Peter Sellers movie, in being there, the audience is expected to be smart and be in the joke. But I think with Kamala Harris, the press is counting, and the Democrats are counting on the audience to be super dumb and not realize that Kamala Harris is in fact dumb, but to take her as smart. So yeah, I think it's actually a very interesting reference point to compare, because Kamala Harris really does, she really is in a way in a kind of zone of silliness that we really haven't seen, at least not in my lifetime. I mean, we've had candidates that were kind of comical, like Michael Dukakis, but Michael Dukakis fundamentally was not a silly man.
Right. Yeah. I know that you are a voracious reader of the classics period. Let us hope that on November 5th, Plato is not proven right when he argued that democracy should be governed by philosopher kings and not by the populace. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Dinesh, it is such a pleasure having you on. Again, people, the book Vindicating Trump comes out on October 8th, but you can pre-order it right now. And the documentary, the movie, comes out in a couple of days, September 27th. Make sure to go see it. Stay on the line so we can say goodbye offline. Thank you so much for coming on, Dinesh, and best of luck with this project.
My pleasure.
Cheers.